Hello and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good evening and welcome to the second episode of India's biggest foreign policy controversies. So the topic for today is how Nehru lost to China. Several critics have often pointed out that Prime Minister Nehru was largely responsible for the mishandling of India's relationship with China, particularly over the boundary dispute. Be it the debacle of 1962 war, or be it the persistent nature of the boundary dispute, the responsibility for these challenges that we face with China has been laid at the doorstep of Prime Minister Nehru by several of his critics. So today, let us examine how far the criticism holds good, and was really Nehru responsible for all the problems that even today that we face with China. So this discussion is part of a very interesting new series that we have launched on our YouTube channel. And under the series, we are discussing some interesting foreign policy issues under different prime ministers of India. And the focus here is to bring out a nuanced debate on some of the controversial foreign policy choices that India has made in the past and also in contemporary times. So do attend all these sessions live by joining me at 7 p.m. right here on our YouTube channel. You can take a look at the schedule as well. And in these sessions, we promise that the discussions would be politically unbiased to ensure that the discussion is relevant for UPSC Civil Services Examination. So if you guys are liking our initiatives, do support us with your likes, your comments, and without fail, subscribe to our channel. So before we start today's discussion, there's a very important announcement. On the 7th of April, we are going to conduct Unacademy Civil Services Championship test, UCSC, which gives you an opportunity to attempt a UPSC standard question paper, and you stand to win attractive scholarships almost up to 90% on our IAS courses. Along with that, you can even stand to win rewards worth 40 crore rupees. So do make use of this offer, and you can register for the scholarship test by using the link provided in the video description. Or you can even contact us at the number provided over here. So with this, let's get started with today's discussion and focus on the broader aspects of India-China relations and to what extent can we hold Nehru accountable for some of the challenges that we are facing even today. Now, I'm sure many of you know that in today's geopolitical chessboard, one of the most challenging relationships for India to manage is that with China. The neighborhood relationship that India shares with China happens to be one of the most challenging relations of today. This often is depicted as a clash of civilizations, as both India and China represent two ancient, thriving civilizations. Since ancient to medieval times till the modern times, both India and China have been the hallmark of civilizational development, from administration to scientific advancement to economic development and political dominance. Both Indian and Chinese civilizations have been at the forefront of the development of the entire Asia and its neighborhood. If you look at ancient India and ancient China, in fact, you find a lot of similarities as well. And what's interesting to note is that today we might have a hostile relationship. Today we might consider China as an aggressive neighbor. But in the past, there are several instances where India-China had a very cordial relationship. For example, if you look at the Cholas, who dominated the Indian Ocean, who also extended their influence beyond Southeast Asia towards East Asia, you will notice that the Cholas had established a very good diplomatic and even trading relationship with the Song dynasty of China. So you not only see a thriving economic and diplomatic and cultural relationship, but there was even military and strategic cooperation between the Cholas from southern India and the Song dynasty of China. From naval cooperation to anti-piracy missions near Singapore, the Chola Navy and the Navy of the Song dynasty would work together from South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. So there is a history of collaboration, there is a history of close cooperation between the two ancient civilizations. Then you look at other cultural links. For example, Buddhism. Buddhism that took birth in India traveled to China beyond the Himalayas. Several Chinese travelers visited India, marking a direct historical link from Huensang to Fahian. So, across the Himalayan passes as well, there are recorded references that indicate border trade and cultural exchange between Indian and Chinese civilizations. So, despite this historical closeness, in modern times, in contemporary geopolitics, today India and China have become hostile to each other, and this is largely due to Chinese aggression, due to Chinese expansionist behavior. So to understand this, we need to trace the chronology of events. We need to start from late 1940s till 1962. We need to examine some of the critical events that took place during this 20-year period when Prime Minister Nehru was in power. To understand whether Prime Minister Nehru was responsible for the challenges in India-China relationship, or can we hold Nehru directly accountable for the mishandling of the relationship, we need to examine these events one by one, and this has to be a critical, comprehensive assessment. So let's begin the discussion here by first pointing out the allegations and the criticism that is leveled against Prime Minister Nehru. Several political opponents, and as well as analysts and strategic experts, and even former officers and diplomats, right? They've all pointed out that these are the list of allegations and criticism that comes up against Prime Minister Nehru with regard to his handling of China, and particularly the way the border dispute was handled. The first criticism is that, did Nehru rush to recognize Communist China when the PRC was established in 1949? What was the urgency on India's part to recognize a communist China when the rest of the democratic countries were hesitating and waiting to give official recognition to China? Couldn't India have leveraged this aspect and ensured that our security along the Himalayan borders could have been protected by using it as a leverage against the PRC, which was a newly established regime? So this is something we will examine in detail. Next criticism is about Nehru's handling of the question of Tibet, China's annexation of Tibet that displayed its aggressive expansionist power, right? And the way it treated the Tibetans, and how India responded to those events. What did India do during these developing events? And did India do enough to leverage the issue to India's advantage? So here there is some criticism against Nehru, and we will examine this in detail as well. Next biggest criticism against Nehru is that it's often alleged that Nehru was too idealistic. In fact, he even allegedly developed a very romanticist view of India-China relations when he championed the slogan Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. He failed to see China's inherent aggressive behavior, which was very evident from 1949 itself, right from its establishment. Critics are pointing out that Nehru did not acknowledge the realistic paradigm and did not take these proactive measures to counteract Chinese aggression right from the beginning. Because of this romanticist view, he had complete faith in India-China friendship, and he even championed the slogan Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai through the mid-1950s. But later, by 1959-1960, as China got aggressive against India, as it escalated the border tensions, both in Aksai Chin, in the western sector, and as well as towards the Nefa region, that is today's Arunachal Pradesh, or the then Northeast Frontier Agency, only then Nehru felt betrayed by China. He even got disillusioned by the way China was reacting against India in an aggressive manner. Eventually, some of the disastrous policies that were adopted under Nehru's administration and the outcome of the 1962 war, the border war that India-China fought, and how it delivered a humiliating loss for India because of some of the strategic tactical blunders that allegedly were committed by the Nehru administration. So along with all these important issues, we should also examine another popular criticism against Nehru. There is a lot of traction, especially on the internet and social media, that it was because of Nehru that India could not become a UNSC permanent member. There are reports, there are again theories that India was offered a UNSC permanent seat, but Nehru denied this and gifted this away to China. So we will have to examine how far these claims are, and that completes this assessment of how Nehru dealt with China and did Nehru lose to China. So let's carry out this assessment in a very neutral manner, keeping all political affiliations aside, and ensure that the discussions are relevant for UPSC Civil Services exam. So let's begin with a quick history about the establishment of PRC. If you have to understand why China behaves in such an aggressive manner even today, right, you will find the answers in China's history. You might have read in newspapers that China is very aggressive in South China Sea with regard to its maritime disputes with Southeast Asian countries. You might have even read that China is aggressive against other neighbors as well, be it Mongolia, even with its close partner Russia, and especially with Western powers with whom it shares a Cold War rivalry today. China is known to be an aggressive power, right, that puts the other countries under pressure constantly. So India shares a disputed boundary with such a country, and constantly we are at the receiving end of Chinese aggression and its expansionist tactics. So if you want to know why China behaves in this manner, if you want an answer to this question, you need to examine the history of China and how the PRC was established. The People's Republic of China is the modern Chinese state that was born in the year 1949, in October 1949. Today, as you know, China is a communist authoritarian state. That is the political system that PRC has adopted. Correct? From October 1949, China came under the rule of the Communist Party, the CPC or the CCP. The Chinese Communist Party or the Communist Party of China established its control over mainland Chinese territory, and thus the regime of PRC, the government, this communist authoritarian government of PRC was established. But what is the history behind its establishment? What drives the PRC today as well to be so aggressive? In fact, if you look at the last 70 odd years, China has consistently been aggressive against its neighbors and against its rival countries as well. No other country even compares to what China has done with regard to its territorial expansionism, and also with regard to the way in which it has threatened the sovereignty and integrity of other nations. Right? Again, to find answers to this question, we have to look at China's ancient and medieval history and how it is linked with the modern history of China. As I was mentioning earlier, just like India, China is also a great civilization. There's no doubt about it. A thriving civilization at one point. There was self-sustaining agriculture, industrial development, advanced scientific development since ancient times. So in every possible way, Indian and Chinese civilizations were very comparable. So the people of China inherently were very proud of their culture. If you look at, let's say, the medieval times, when the Qing dynasty had established the empire across mainland China, right, somewhere in the middle of the 17th century. Since then, the people of China have been very proud of their identity and culture, just like anyone would be if they belong to an ancient, thriving civilization. Just like we Indians are very proud of our civilization, our cultural heritage, the Chinese also have always been very proud of their civilization, their influence all across Asia. Because some of the previous Chinese empires, be it the Song dynasty, the Qing dynasty, their influence has stretched all the way from East Asia to West Asia to Central Asia. They have dominated the seas and the oceans, from Indian Ocean to the Pacific. So given that rich history, it's quite natural for the Chinese people and in general the society of China to be very proud of their civilizational heritage. But over a period of time, throughout the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, China faced a lot of outside exploitation. Or at least that is the perception that Chinese have developed. If India felt that it was exploited by European colonizers, led by Britain, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, etc., who decimated our economy, our agriculture and industrial system, and even our cultural practices, China also went through something similar. At the hands of Imperial Japan, China suffered a lot of humiliation in the last couple of centuries. Under Imperial Fascist Japan especially, China had suffered a lot of atrocities Imperial Japan had committed brutal killings, mass rapes and slaughters, devastating mainland Chinese economy. So this indeed left a deep wound, a deep scar that continued to affect the Chinese society and the perception that China had of outsiders. And even at the hands of European colonial powers, both Britain and France, they did decimate the Chinese economy as well. So during these 200, 300 years, from 17th to 19th century, China did feel that it was being exploited by outsiders. It was being targeted, decimated from outside exploitative powers. So in 1911, the Qing Empire was thrown out and Republic of China was established under the KMT, the Kuomintang Party. The Kuomintang Party, which built its grassroots network and popularity, it challenged the monarchy and threw out the Chinese Empire and established the Republic of China. But the Kuomintangs also became very unpopular quickly due to large-scale corruption, lack of welfare, lack of development, and how the Republic of China was not standing up to outside pressure and exploitation from outside powers. Particularly during the First and Second World War, during that period from 1920s to 1940s. The perception of the Chinese kept on increasing that they are still vulnerable to outside exploitation. And the government, the Republic of China, doesn't care about this. It doesn't care about Chinese identity and Chinese pride. So this is where a party was born with a new ideology, the Communist Party of China, in the year 1921. So it's been more than 100 years since the Chinese Communist Party was established. By then, the ideology of communism, which is a left-wing ideology, was gaining momentum across Europe, Asia, and rest of the world. And in 1921, the Chinese Communist Party was established. The Communist Party would work closely with its support base, primarily the farmers, the peasants, and workers. And it would motivate them by stating that the Communist Party stands with the weaker classes. The Communist Party projected itself as a party of the poor, a party of the marginalized people. And then came the popular communist leader Mao Zedong or Mao Zedong, who would champion the communist ideology and even lay the groundwork for an extremist ideology, the left-wing extremist ideology, popularly known as the Maoist ideology. So under Mao Zedong, the Communist Party would lead the Chinese Civil War that broke out by 1930s and lasted till late 1940s. So during these 2 decades, there was complete chaos and turmoil in Chinese society. There was a complete political upheaval that happened where the Communist Party was locked in a conflict, in a battle with the Republic of China, the state of China, mainland China, which was under the Kuomintang Party or the KMT. So this civil war between the Kuomintang that ruled Republic of China and the Communist Party under Maoist influence. This civil war led to large-scale violence, and eventually in the civil war, the communists, they won the conflict. Inspired by Mao Zedong's violent rebellion, they threw out Republic of China and they cornered the KMT into a small island which is called Taiwan. This is the origin of the current standing dispute as well between People's Republic of China and Republic of China in Taiwan. So the then Chinese government, the Republic of China, led by the KMT, was thrown out of mainland China, cornered into this small island that is Taiwan. So the Communist Party captured power under the leadership of Mao Zedong. Now this is what explains the inherent aggressive ideology of the Chinese state even today. Because if you look at Maoism, which is a left-wing extremist ideology, it is rooted in the philosophy of using violence to achieve justice. That's what Mao Zedong propagated. He advised, he inspired the farmers, the peasants and workers to take up arms against the state, to rebel and lead an armed rebellion to capture state power. Mao Zedong promised to the people of China that if the masses joined his struggle and took up arms against the Republic of China and throughout the state, he promised that he would restore China's ancient glory, the lost glory. He would restore the territorial dominance, the geopolitical influence of China, along with rebuilding its economy. It was this vision, this ideology that became the foundation of the PRC. Eventually, the communists, they defeated the KMT throughout Republic of China and established the modern Chinese state in mainland China in 1949. So PRC is essentially a one-state country. It's essentially a one-party rule that you see here, a one-party state, where it's the Communist Party which is in power. Right? There are no fundamental rights, no democratic rights. It is an authoritarian extremist ideology which serves as the political foundation of the PRC. So, inspired by Maoist extremist ideology, the PRC continues to remain an aggressive power and continues to believe in the usage of violence and aggression whenever necessary. And it also believes that expansionism of its territory is essential and necessary to bring back Chinese influence, to restore Chinese influence. So partly the answer can be found here, which explains Chinese aggression and its aggressive behavior. In fact, we got to see this immediately after the PRC was established. By 1949, the PRC, which was limited to this territory here, this boundary that I'm drawing here, this essentially was mainland China. Imagine this was Chinese territory. Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, they were all not part of China. Essentially, China was not even a neighbor of India. So as PRC established its rule here by throwing out KMT to Taiwan, this is Taiwan here, this small island. So Republic of China was thrown out to Taiwan. The Kuomintangs fled to Taiwan and the communists took control of mainland China. And immediately in 1947 and in 1949, we had seen the expansion of Chinese territory. Even as the civil war was going on, the communist army, the Red Army, had captured Inner Mongolia, integrated this into Chinese territory. This was an annexation. Then, with the establishment of People's Republic of China following the end of the civil war, the PRC annexed Xinjiang as well, which otherwise should have been East Turkestan, where you find the native Uyghur Muslims. That's why even today in Xinjiang there is a resistance against Chinese presence and occupation, and some of the radical Uyghurs, they even resort to terrorism against China to liberate Xinjiang even today. Then finally in 1950, China would annex Tibet. It would annex the Himalayan kingdom of Tibet, and thus it would become a neighbor of India. So as China became India's neighbor through such aggressive policies and measures, it obviously created alarm for India and other Himalayan states. And it actually created a fear or a paranoia across Asia as well regarding the aggressive rise, the expansionist rise of China. The Western powers, of course, were concerned, worried about China's aggressive behavior. And it's in this context that we should understand how Prime Minister Nehru dealt with China as a state. So first, let's begin with the birth of China. Let's talk about what happened as soon as PRC was established, because this is where we find a very important criticism against Nehru. It's alleged that Nehru rushed to recognize China and gave official recognition even before Western countries had given recognition. So several political critics and opponents and even analysts and experts, even today, they criticize Nehru for rushing to give recognition to China. So let's examine this claim, let's examine this criticism, whether it's valid or not. What did Nehru do? Why was it done? And were there any other alternatives for India? Now this issue is very carefully examined in great detail by Vijay Gokhale, India's former foreign secretary, who has written a wonderful book called Crosswinds. In this book, he explores and examines the Nehru-Zhou Enlai era and the Anglo-American competition over China. It's a great book that details India's initial engagement with China. And here he goes on to analyze the choice that Nehru made to recognize China immediately after the PRC was established. I told you that PRC, People's Republic of China, had been established in October 1949. Within a month, by November 1949, India was already considering giving official recognition to the PRC. So by the end of 1949, India had become the first major power, that to a democratic nation, which had given recognition to an authoritarian communist regime. So what was the need for a democratic country like India to recognize an aggressive communist country like China without getting any guarantees or without securing Indian interests? So let's explore this issue. See, Prime Minister Nehru was someone who held a worldly view, someone who was seen as a progressive liberal leader, and he strongly believed in the spirit of friendship in diplomacy. Nehru realized that it was important to cultivate relations with China, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with the communist ideology or not. There were some common similarities as well that India saw with a Chinese Civil War. If India had fought against colonial powers to gain freedom, even though ours was largely peaceful with regard to our freedom struggle, whereas Chinese Civil War was largely violent and aggressive, but still there was a common thread where India sympathized with China. You could understand the frustration, the pain of the Chinese people, how the weaker classes had been oppressed by the corrupt, how they had been exploited by outside powers. This was something we could connect with. There was a human connection, and that is something that Nehru would appreciate as well. So apart from that, the Cold War rivalries were just beginning. Second World War had ended. Cold War divisions between Western countries and the Soviet power bloc had started to emerge. So obviously, China, being a communist power now under Mao Zedong, under the Communist Party, was seen as a challenge for Western powers. So US was clearly hesitating. It was trying to hold back any official recognition to China. But UK would insist that India should move ahead with recognition being given to China. And also, Nehru would personally believe that it was in India's national interest to recognize China and start out a friendly relationship. At this point, please note, China was still not a neighbor of India. It had still not annexed Tibet. Annexation of Tibet would happen next year in 1950. But even now, Nehru saw that China would be a major Asian power, and along with India, these two Asian powers would dominate the Indo-Pacific. It was pure pragmatism that drove Nehru to give recognition to China with the hope of building a friendly partnership. So Vijay Gokhale argues there was nothing wrong with this. It was a strategic vision, a very realistic, pragmatic vision of Nehru that led him to rush before other countries in giving recognition to China. But however, there is one point of valid criticism against Nehru. Vijay Gokhale says that Nehru should have had the farsightedness to use this as a leverage to protect India's interests in the Himalayan neighborhood. Since China was also craving recognition, the PRC, which had just been established, would be craving for such recognition from other major powers, especially from India. Because India would be an Asian power, a country in the same neighborhood, and more importantly, a democratic state. So PRC would crave India's recognition as well. And that is something Prime Minister Nehru could have leveraged. Leveraged for what? A leverage to ensure that China doesn't threaten security interests of India in the Himalayan neighborhood. Even though China was not a neighbor yet, China's aggressive tendencies were very clear. The rise of the Communist Party, the Chinese Civil War, and the rise of Maoist ideology had made it very apparent to the world that modern China, PRC, would be an aggressive expansionist power. By then, it had already annexed Inner Mongolia and then Xinjiang as well. It was only a matter of time that China would set its eyes on Tibet. So this was an opportunity for Prime Minister Nehru to secure Indian interests. There should have been a diplomatic engagement where India would have conveyed to China that, see, we are willing to give recognition. We will officially recognize the PRC and establish diplomatic relations. In return, can you give us a guarantee that you will not threaten the security interests of Himalayan states? Because when PRC established itself, the Himalayan kingdoms, they were completely worried and scared. From Nepal to Tibet to Sikkim to Bhutan. all the Himalayan kingdoms were very worried and concerned about Chinese aggression and possible violence and expansionism by China. Is that clear? So this was an opportunity for India which was lost by Prime Minister Nehru. But again, Vijay Gokhale notes that it's easy to look back now in hindsight and judge what was done or what could have been done. But in those circumstances, the decision to recognize China and establish a friendly relationship was not an entirely wrong decision. Is that clear? So this criticism doesn't stand against Prime Minister Nehru. It was taken in India's national interest, with the interest of building close relations with another Asian power. Because we did have a similar background, we could lead the developing underdeveloped world, and China would inevitably be a major Asian power, and that indeed was recognized by Nehru. But where Nehru possibly lost an opportunity was in not using this as a leverage. Because within India as well, there were concerns about the rise of China. Several Indian chief ministers had expressed this concern internally. Internally, they were asking Nehru, will China pose a threat? Will it annex Tibet? Will it threaten us in the Himalayan border areas? But Nehru largely dismissed the concerns. This is where possibly Nehru lost the opportunity, not in recognizing China, but in not using it as a leverage to get a guarantee, a diplomatic guarantee from China that it will not threaten the border areas in the Himalayan belt. So this is often pointed out as a lost opportunity. Is it a mistake? Definitely no. You can't quantify this as a mistake, but definitely it was a lost opportunity. Right? With greater strategic vision, this possibly could have been leveraged against China to get some guarantees, right? So that China is accountable. China is answerable tomorrow if it were to display aggression. Next, the next point is very important. What did India do? What did Prime Minister Nehru do exactly when PRC annexed Tibet in 1950? By 1950, PRC clearly established its expansionist tendencies. Now, there was no doubt in anyone's mind about what China wanted. China wanted to expand its territory, restore the glory of the Qing dynasty and the Song dynasties, expand its influence from Eurasia to Central Asia, West Asia to East Asia. So this became very evident when it annexed Tibet and it further expanded the territory, and overnight now it had become a neighbor of India. It had become a Himalayan state. So here, what did India do? Did India recognize the annexation of Tibet? Did India accept Tibet's forceful annexation by China? Did we give it legitimacy? Let's examine this. See, obviously, India was deeply concerned and worried when China was showing this aggression. Following the annexation of Tibet, there was criticism from India. Prime Minister Nehru did raise concerns about the annexation of Tibet. But however, Nehru would come around and eventually accept the annexation of Tibet. Nehru would consult with the British, consult with other countries as well. Most countries realized that there was nothing else they could have done to possibly stop the annexation of Tibet. Britain had urged India to provide any possible support to Tibet apart from military assistance. But India realized that there was no way that India could provide any kind of support or assistance apart from humanitarian aid and support. Given China's military superiority, given that the people of Tibet were in no position to resist a Chinese annexation, there was nothing that any other outside power could have done. In fact, later, even European powers, even US itself, they would all come around to accept the annexation of Tibet by China. So India couldn't have prevented the annexation of Tibet. That is out of the question, right? But when India expressed some concern about the developments, this triggered China. It angered China, and it led Mao Zedong to believe that India was trying to meddle in its internal matters. Parallelly, there was something else happening in the Himalayan neighborhood. The small Himalayan kingdoms were now even more worried and scared as soon as Tibet fell into the hands of China. So Sikkim, remember, Sikkim still had not merged with India. It was still a protectorate state, right? Bhutan and Nepal were separate independent kingdoms. So they all rushed to India for assistance, for help. Bhutan and India had already signed a treaty of friendship in 1949, where India had committed to provide support for Bhutan's defense against external threats. Bhutan had outsourced its foreign policy to India. This was primarily done to secure Bhutan against any Chinese aggression. Nepal, after the annexation of Tibet, would sign the 1950 Treaty of Peace and Friendship, and it would seek direct defense support, military support from India. Sikkim would further closely embrace India as a protectorate state, and India would in a way become responsible for the defense of these Himalayan kingdoms. So as India was building this strategic partnership with Nepal, Bhutan and Sikkim, China was watching India, and it led China to assume that India could be a potential threat and a concern. Because first India had expressed some concern about annexation of Tibet, which was not appreciated by China. China saw this as its internal matter. China saw that India had no right to interfere. And apart from that, the close strategic defense relations that Nehru started building with Nepal, Bhutan and Sikkim is what caused concern for China as well. So this decision was entirely keeping in mind India's national interests again, to secure India's security interests. Because either ways, there was nothing else that other countries could have done. Accepting Tibetan annexation had become a ground reality. Not just India, every other major power did the same, right? They all thought about advancing their friendship with China, and most countries accepted the one China principle and policy. Because at this time, there were two major questions in front of the international community. One was about the presence of two Chinese governments. One is PRC by the Communist Party that controlled mainland China, which included Inner Mongolia, Tibet and Xinjiang by now. The other was Republic of China, led by Kuomintang Party in Taiwan. So it was this Chinese state which still had the UN membership, the permanent membership. So PRC was still not recognized as a legitimate government of China by most of the countries. So China started insisting, that is PRC started insisting, that you should recognize that there is only one China. And also with regard to the territorial issues in Tibet, Xinjiang and in other frontier regions, there were questions about China's sovereignty. So China kept insisting that one China policy and one China principle should be accepted by every country in the world. So eventually most countries adopted the one China principle and one China policy, and they recognized only PRC as the legitimate authority of China. They accepted that all these territories, be it Tibet or Xinjiang, that it belongs to PRC's sovereignty. Most countries stayed away from the regime in Taiwan, the Republic of China. This was the reality of that era, and India also did the same. India had to advance its relations while securing the concerns in the Himalayan belt. But here, there is one valid criticism that comes up against Nehru, which is the Indian government at that point should have had the farsightedness to think and envision the possible threats and concerns. Because from here onwards, Nehru would be obsessed with building a friendly relationship with China with all the good intention. But problem was, it was a short-sighted approach. Given the fact that China would be an aggressive power, right? You should have seen through the possible consequences in the future. Because Mao Zedong already had laid down an aggressive strategy for China to gain control, further control over Tibet. Because within Tibet, there was a rebellion against the Chinese annexation. Tibet had been a problematic region and China was struggling to control the rebellion here. So Mao Zedong laid down a theory. It's popularly called the five-finger policy of Mao Zedong. He equated Tibet to the palm of your hand. He said Tibet is like the palm, and if we have to dominate Tibet, control Tibet, keep Tibet firmly under our control, then China should meddle and interfere and destabilize the five extensions of Tibet, which are the five fingers of the palm. So the reference here was basically to other Himalayan kingdoms that border Tibet, that is Sikkim, Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh, back then it was Northeast Frontier Agency, Bhutan, Nepal, and these five frontier areas here, these five small Himalayan kingdoms, they were referred to by Mao Zedong as the five extensions of Tibet. So today, if you're wondering why China keeps interfering in Ladakh, in Nepal, in Bhutan as well, in Sikkim and Arunachal Pradesh, this is your answer. Right from 1950, China has been obsessed about the five extensions of Tibet based on Mao Zedong's five-finger policy, the five-finger strategy. Mao Zedong urged the Chinese state, to focus on the 5 extensions, the 5 Himalayan kingdoms that lie next to Tibet, to interfere there, to destabilize and to dominate, so that Tibet will firmly remain under Chinese control. This is something which possibly should have been foreseen. Of course, India did build close relations with Nepal and Bhutan and Sikkim, but problem was India did not safeguard its interests across the border areas. Because India was under the assumption that we inherited the British era boundaries. Post 1947, India safely assumed that British era boundaries would be the boundaries of modern day India. But China later would develop a different viewpoint, a different perspective. So if you ask me whether India's approach towards Tibet was entirely wrong, no, definitely no. And this fact has been acknowledged by many experts and even by Tibetans themselves. Here I present an argument, a recent argument, that was brought up by the president of Central Tibetan Administration, which is headquartered at Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh. The president of the Central Tibetan Administration, Penpa Sereng, he opined that many experts say that Nehru did a blunder by recognizing China's sovereignty over Tibet. But we understand why Nehru did that. He was doing it in the interest of India, to secure India's interest, to build better relations with China, to ensure China is not a threat to India. So per se, the decision itself was not wrong, because India did express concern, and later we accommodated the Tibetan refugees. I'll come to that point later. Because few years later, by 1959, a new crisis would come up here, triggering a massive refugee crisis, and it was India which stepped up under Nehru and sheltered the Tibetan refugees. This would further instigate China as well. I'll come to that point. But first understand that the decision to recognize that Tibet is a part of China was in itself not entirely incorrect or wrong. Even if you look at it in retrospect, it was a logical choice to make, because every other country was recognizing one China policy and one China principle. PRC was getting legitimacy. Tibet was being seen as Chinese territory. Everyone realized that there was nothing else that could be done to prevent China from occupying Tibet. So what's the point of triggering further tensions and disputes? So the better approach was to be more realistic and pragmatic and protect our own interests. But one criticism here is that there should have been a far-sighted approach to not trust China entirely. While we continued building friendly relations, on the other hand, we should have been watchful, we should have been cautious. That is where Prime Minister Nehru went wrong. This is what leads to the next set of problems that began from 1954. Beginning from 1954, a set of border issues started propping up. Until then, Prime Minister Nehru strongly believed, he had full faith that China will not get aggressive against India. In fact, you can even say he was blindsided. This was blind faith and trust on China that even though it's a communist country rooted in aggressive ideology, Nehru believed that China will not threaten India because that would risk a bigger conflict, a regional, possible, a global conflict, and that would act as a limitation on China. That was Nehru's assumption. But world of geopolitics doesn't run by assumptions, right? While seeking out good relations, while giving recognition to China and its annexation of Tibet, while securing our interests with Nepal, Bhutan, there should have been another step taken to bring greater limitations, constraints on China as well. That could have happened if India had been more cautious, if India had not trusted China. Because from 1950 to 54, Nehru got preoccupied with building a friendly relationship, genuinely believing that China can be a friend, can be trusted entirely. But by then, China was up to something else, particularly in the Ladakh region. Now, this point is very important. By 1954, India would publish its maps, right? And we showed Aksai Chin as part of India's Ladakh, as part of Jammu and Kashmir, which by then had acceded to the Indian Union. India was living in this dream world where we presumed that British era boundaries would be our modern day boundaries. This again is a shortcoming of Prime Minister Nehru. There should have been enough strategic thought behind this, to think about what China would say about these boundaries. Would China accept them? Would China create problems? There was no thought given to it, and India went ahead and published the maps unilaterally, showing all these areas as part of India. This, of course, is a correct claim as per historical records, but keeping in mind possible Chinese opposition would have helped India plan ahead, would have helped India remain more cautious. But as India published the maps, China did raise the issue, not just in Aksai Chin in Ladakh, but also towards the eastern sector, and it dismissed the validity of McMahon line as well. So suddenly there were two new problems propping up. But however, what is interesting to note is that initially China underplayed the border issue. China did not make this a very big issue initially. See, after publishing these maps, India detected China's road construction activity taking place in our Aksai Chin. A strategic road, a strategic highway, which exists even today, in fact, it's a critical highway, which links Tibet with Xinjiang, was being built by China. This road connecting Xinjiang over here in the Xinjiang province with the capital of Tibet, Lhasa. This highway was absolutely critical because both Tibet and Xinjiang were problematic frontier regions for China. China wanted security measures to be taken to move the troops quickly to control any rebellions and resistance in these two territories. For that strategic purpose, it needed a viable road, a connectivity between Xinjiang and Tibet, where it could move the troops easily to secure both the problematic provinces. So that is the primary interest China had in Aksai Chin. It provides the best link. You can see in the map as well, it is sandwiched between Xinjiang and Tibet. So China had begun the construction of this strategic highway which would pass right through Indian territory claimed by India as per historical British records. India believed that the boundaries that we inherited from the British would continue to be the boundaries of modern India. There was no farsightedness from the Nehru administration to think about what China would say, what problems could China create, right? I'm not saying that India shouldn't have published the map. That of course was the right claim of India based on the boundaries that British India had signed with the Kingdom of Tibet. As India was the successor state, India was the inheritor, it was absolutely valid on India's part to claim these areas. But problem was there was no strategic vision, no farsightedness to think whether China might create problems. Will China accept these boundaries? That would have given India more time to plan, to prepare and to counter. So here Nehru blindly believed what China was telling him. In 1954, when these issues had come up, Nehru paid a historic visit to China. During this visit, he would very closely interact with Zhou Enlai. And that is when the principles of 5 peaceful coexistence was championed, also called the Panchsheel Agreement. Nehru would have full faith in China, believing that China is a friendly partner, and would go on to sign the Panchsheel Agreement, also called the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Both countries committed that they will coexist with each other. They agreed that there is enough space in Asia for both the powers to rise without running into a conflict with each other. So here Nehru had placed blind faith in China, was trusting China completely. But behind the scenes, China was building a road, a strategic highway right through Indian territory in Aksai Chin. Now, can you tell me in the comments, which is this highway that I'm referring to? Even today, this highway is of great concern to India. There is a certain name or a alphanumeric number attached to this highway. Please find out the name of this highway and mention that in the comments below. It can come as a prelims question, a map-based question. This highway running through Aksai Chin, which is Indian territory, right, which later was occupied by China. It connects Xinjiang with Tibet, a strategic road for China. When Nehru brought up this question, when Nehru visited China, he brought up this question. He said, how come you're building a road which goes right through our territory? That's a challenge to our sovereignty. So Chinese tried to underplay this. They said, this is not a major issue. It's just a British era issue that has been left behind, which we can sort out later. The PRC said, we haven't had enough time to sort out our boundaries, right? And China tried to underplay this. So strategists, analysts, they all point out that this was a deliberate deception strategy by China. You get to see this even today in China's behavior with other countries. In fact, there's a popular name given to this strategy of China as well. I'll explain what it is, but I want you guys to give me the name of this Chinese strategy. See, China has this unique behavior in geopolitics, especially with its neighboring countries. It carries out an incremental annexation, a step-by-step annexation of certain territories for strategic reasons. China doesn't confront a country immediately. It will not escalate the issue immediately because it knows that there would be a counter reaction. There would be criticism from international community. So what China does is that it will take one step after the other. It will create a small escalation and then it will lie. It will appear to dismiss the concerns. It will say it was just a confusion, just a matter of misrepresentation, and it will try to open talks. It will try to negotiate. This is basically a time-buying tactic. It's a tactic to delay the process, to buy some time, to further change the status quo and strengthen its position in these areas where China is raising a dispute. And slowly over the years, it carries out this creeping annexation, step-by-step annexation, right? And this is something we have seen repeatedly. It's a repeat pattern that China shows in its behavior, right? Even today, if you look at the Doklam standoff, or let's say even the Ladakh crisis, or the South China Sea dispute as well, right? With Vietnam, Philippines, with all these countries, even with Japan in East China Sea, China has used the same strategy. It carries out a limited escalation. It doesn't want a full-blown out situation where there is counter reaction as well. It will carry out a limited escalation, wait for some time. It will try to apologize. It will try to talk. It will try to dismiss the concerns, which is just a time-buying tactic, right? And by then, it will further carry out next step of escalation, possibly to annex more territory, change the status quo. By the time you realize, China would have gained an upper hand with regard to the disputed area. That is exactly what China did with Nehru. When Nehru brought up this question of this highway being built through Aksai Chin, initially Zhou Enlai dismissed it as if it was a non-issue, as if it was just a question of confusion and misrepresentation. China said, we will discuss this, we'll sort this out. Right? The British have just left us. We haven't had time to look at the boundaries. China still was, yet to come up with its final boundaries. So China dismissed the concerns and Nehru bought this. And this is where possibly Nehru made a big mistake, right? And this is where Nehru is criticized for his idealism, for his blind faith, his illusion in the theory of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. See, it was great to build a friendly partnership. There's nothing wrong with that. India has always been a friendly power. But problem is, you should also be cautious. You should have the strategic vision, the far-sightedness to predict what might happen and prepare accordingly. Basically, in geopolitics, there is a popular saying, you carry a carrot and a stick in the same, in each of your hand. Of course, you offer a carrot to everyone, make friends with everyone, but keep the stick ready if someone is threatening you. Right? This is what was missed from the Indian side. And Nehru went on to sign the Panchsheel Agreement, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that you can see over here. Through this, India, China both promised that we will respect each other's integrity and sovereignty, mutual respect. We promise that we will not interfere in each other's internal affairs. We promise that we will give equal respect and treat this as an equal partnership, and mutual non-aggression became a commitment, that we will not resort to war or conflict in case of disputes. Rather, we will peacefully resolve any dispute through talks and negotiations, and we will peacefully coexist with each other. These are the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, or the Panchsheel, which itself is derived from Buddhist principles. The principle of Panchsheel itself has a Buddhist influence. It's rooted in Buddhism. That is what bound India and China culturally. So it was only appropriate to use this as a basis for the Panchsheel Agreement. But however, this is where Nehru was deceived as well. Right when the border issue was propping up, China was building a road through Aksai Chin, India was not prepared for what was coming. India was blindsided because of the blind faith Nehru had placed in China. So parallelly, what China did was it waited for the completion of the strategic road. The Tibet-Xinjiang road was completed. It would further raise and escalate the Aksai issue because now Aksai Chin was of great strategic value for China in the western sector. Then to further deflect India, to further keep India on the back foot, it opened a new front in Northeast Frontier Agency to further strengthen its claims over Aksai Chin. So post 1954-55 is when India started dealing with this serious border challenge, and now China was getting hostile and aggressive. Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai was forgotten. Mutual non-aggression, mutual respect had been set aside. China was now questioning India's integrity and sovereignty, not just in Ladakh in the western sector, but also in Nepal, that is today's Arunachal Pradesh, in eastern sector. China started calling Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. Even now, in Chinese maps, it's a Chinese name which is assigned to India's Arunachal Pradesh. Right? Since 1947, India has had full control of Arunachal Pradesh, right? Which was then NEFA, but China has dismissed this. China said we will not accept the McMahon line, because China's argument was, see, we were not party to the Simla Convention. What's the Simla Convention? It was this convention that was held in 1914 that led to the drawing of the McMahon line between British India and the then Kingdom of Tibet. Is that clear? The McMahon Commission had been set up through the Shimla Convention of 1914, which was negotiated between the then Kingdom of Tibet and British India. So neither the government of India existed, right? Neither PRC existed when McMahon line was drawn. So China brought this up and said, why should we accept British imperial boundaries? So China said, we have a different perception of the border based on our historical claims. China wanted fresh negotiations to happen. But here China's interest, real interest, was not just in Arunachal Pradesh. Its primary focus was on Aksai Chin in the western sector. There are reports that China even suggested a trade-off. There are reports that there was a trade-off offered in the 1950s that if India gives up the claims on Aksai Chin, which is more vital to China because of the strategic highway that it was building, then China said, we will not question your claims over NEFA. China said, we will respect McMahon line. We'll accept that Arunachal, that is NEFA, is Indian territory if you give up Aksai Chin in Ladakh entirely. This was reportedly a proposal from China, a trade-off, which again shows China's tactics. It carries out a step-by-step escalation. It doesn't always go for a full frontal military engagement. By using its military status or its hard power, it puts some pressure, it occupies some territory, changes the status quo, then seems to apologize or underplay it or dismiss it, offers to talk and negotiate, which is just a time-buying tactic. And then, after a few years, it will carry out the next escalation. So, over a period of time, China changes the status quo through this strategy. Right? That's what I was asking you. I showed you an image as well that depicted this Chinese strategy. I want you to tell me, which is this Chinese strategy? Today, we have a name for that. Of course, back then, India couldn't have seen this pattern, but at least there should have been farsightedness to not just blindly trust China, but be prepared for the possible consequences. So that is why Nehru faces a lot of criticism here, which is quite valid as well. Many historians, many experts and political opponents, analysts, they all agree that Nehru's romanticism, his idealistic approach towards China, is what led India to pay the price, at least to an extent, if not entirely. You can't blame Nehru for recognizing China, building relations with China. You can't blame Nehru for recognizing Tibet, right? Or even for helping Tibetans later. This is something Nehru deserves appreciation for. But however, he went wrong in trusting China blindly and in not having the strategic vision to deal with possible consequences arising out of an aggressive China. So after all this, in 1959, China carried out the next escalation in Tibet. It tried to crush the uprising by using massive force, triggering a humanitarian crisis in Tibet. So this triggered a massive refugee crisis, and refugees started flowing down into Nepal and India through the Himalayan route. So India stepped up under Prime Minister Nehru and offered asylum to Tibetan refugees. We took in the Tibetan refugees. Even Nepal was convinced by India to take in some Tibetan refugees, and we settled the refugees in camps that were set up across India. One of the biggest Tibetan refugee camp is Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh. That is where Nehru even allowed the Tibetans to set up a parallel government, a government in exile. Even today, there is a parallel Tibetan government, the central Tibetan administration that functions out of here. Right? And this obviously triggered China. Because according to China, these Tibetan monks who were protesting under Dalai Lama, they were all anti-national elements as per China. China saw them as a threat to its integrity and sovereignty. So imagine what will happen when India shelters them. Right? India took in the Dalai Lama as well. The US also was playing a role here in convincing India, helping India. So as Nehru took the decision on humanitarian grounds, of course, he did see a strategic value as well, believing that this could be a leverage for India. Tomorrow, if China were to misbehave with India, potentially the presence of Tibetan refugees could be a leverage for India. So this involvement of India in criticizing the human rights violations in Tibet, in accepting the refugees and the Dalai Lama and sheltering them, right? Not just in Dharamshala, there are many Tibetan refugee camps. There is one massive camp in Karnataka as well, near Madikeri, Kushal Nagar. There are few other Tibetan camps in Odisha and few other states as well. So India sheltered the refugees, took in the Dalai Lama, the religious figurehead of the Tibetan Buddhist monks, and allowed them to set up a parallel government in exile. So all these actions of India were interpreted by China as hostile. In 1950, when India had expressed concern, that itself was seen as Indian interference. And now China concluded that Nehru had become hostile. Right? In China's eyes, India was a democratic country. Even though India was non-aligned, right? We were championing the non-aligned movement. And even though we had chosen an independent foreign policy path during the Cold War, carefully not aligning either with the West or with Soviet Union, still China had its doubts, its suspicion, and this further contributed to the misunderstanding between the two sides. By this period, there was a covert partnership developing between India and US to keep an eye on China as well. Between India's intelligence bureau, which was responsible for both domestic and foreign intelligence at that point, and the CIA of the US, there was a joint collaboration, a joint initiative was taken to run intelligence operations, covert operations in Tibet to monitor China's activities in Tibet. By then, China was even developing and testing a nuclear weapon. It had become a priority for India and US to monitor China's activities in Tibet, how it was dealing with the Tibetan rebellion, and also to keep an eye on China's nuclear program. This collaboration, covert collaboration between the intelligence agencies of India and US, it eventually gave birth to a secretive unit called Establishment 22. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about it. It was established after the 1962 war. It was born out of a joint covert intelligence program between IB and CIA in late 1950s. And there was American assistance in helping IB to run these covert operations against China to monitor its activities. But after the 62 war, after India was defeated, right, India came out with a strategy to raise a covert unit by primarily employing the Tibetan refugees. The refugees who were willing to fight, who were willing to resist China, they were recruited by Indian intelligence agencies. Eventually, it would pass down to RAW after RAW was established in 1968. Because until 1968, IB was handling both domestic and foreign intelligence. So as RAW was established to deal with foreign intelligence in 1968, Establishment 22 was moved under RAW. Today, it's called SFF, Special Frontier Force. It's one of India's most elite secretive covert units and functions as the armed unit of RAW to conduct special operations. So China, which was looking at India's actions, right, especially the concern we had expressed for Tibet, how India accommodated the refugees, Dalai Lama, and allowed them to run a parallel government, plus the secret relationship, the intelligence cooperation as well between India and China, between India and US. They all triggered China to further escalate the border tensions. By now, China had come to a conclusion that India had to be taught a lesson, that Nehru had to be taught a lesson. The misunderstanding was growing day by day, right? And of course, the border issue started flaring up by 1959-1960. Now the problem was not just in Aksai Chin in the western sector, but particularly in the eastern sector along the mcMahon line over here in Nepha in Arunachal. China started creating major problems. Now even Nepha became vital for China because of Tawang. Tawang, which is located here in Arunachal Pradesh, has always been of great value and importance for China, particularly after Tibetan refugees came to India. Because at Tawang, you have a popular Buddhist monastery, the Gelugpa Buddhist monastery, which plays a big role in Tibetan Buddhist politics. China wants to keep an eye on such Buddhist monasteries in India. And also Tawang holds a lot of strategic significance with regard to access to Northeast India. So China stepped up its pressure against India, and this led to frequent border clashes. So by late 1950s, border clashes were taking place between Indian troops and Chinese troops. And even now, Nehru failed to leverage the power of diplomacy. This was a time where India should have allowed diplomacy to work, backed by adequate military preparedness, so that we are prepared for any eventuality. So Nehru's policy was essentially very confusing for us at this point. From 1950 to 54, he placed blind trust and faith in China. This slowly started turning as China started resorting to hostility against India. And by 1959, Nehru was fully disillusioned as China crushed the rebellion in Tibet, opened new fronts with India, kept on carrying out incursions and frequent clashes with Indian forces across the disputed border. It led to complete disillusionment with Nehru, and Nehru now was turning towards military aggressiveness. He adopted a very controversial policy called the forward policy. Many former military officers, diplomats, experts, they attribute the 1962 war to the flawed policy of Nehru, the forward policy. Under the forward policy, Prime Minister Nehru asked for forward deployment of Indian troops. The entire military leadership was against any such aggressive move by India, right? But some say that it wasn't an aggressive move, it was a defensive move just to prepare India for what might come. But the ground reality was very different. The Indian army was not prepared for high altitude warfare. We were completely outnumbered. Records from the 1962 war shows that we were outnumbered in a 1:3 ratio, meaning for every one Indian soldier that we could mobilize in the forward areas, China had mobilized 3 soldiers on the other side. Because also understand the difficulty created by the terrain, the geography of the Himalayan border. China had a distinctive advantage, a natural advantage, because Tibet is a plateau, a flat land. China had already built advanced infrastructure from road to railway network to forward military bases. So it could easily arrange for logistical supplies and communication support and ammunition supplies to supply the armed forces stationed closer to the border areas. But India had the disadvantage. We had to climb up the Himalayan mountains. Our troops had to go up in altitude, right? Adverse weather conditions, very limited oxygen supply, lack of logistics, lack of communication, lack of resupplies. So without keeping these challenges in mind, Nehru ordered a forward deployment which allegedly triggered China, further instigated China. Those who defend Nehru, they say that it was just a defensive policy. You can't hold Nehru accountable for it. But several former officers who were part of the 62 war, right? They've all documented this. They've criticized Nehru for an ill thought out forward policy, for showing aggression when it was not needed. Because every report indicated India would be outnumbered. There was no way India could have fought and defeated China because we weren't prepared. The Indian military at that point wasn't modernized enough. Border infrastructure had not been developed because India was struggling with many other problems. As we discussed the other day, China or Pakistan were not the only problems. There were multitude of problems for India, right? From economic challenges to strategic challenges to serious social challenges were affecting India. So the lack of military preparedness and in general the military superiority of China should have been recognized, and Nehru should have allowed diplomacy to work. Diplomacy is what helps you prevent wars and conflicts, and you back up your diplomacy with your military strength. It is a careful mix of your hard power and soft power that will get you results in geopolitics, that will maintain peace and stability and prevent wars and conflicts. You should show the military strength to deter the enemy and use diplomacy and make diplomacy work to maintain peace and stability. But Nehru did neither of them. Neither the military preparedness was scaled up, which was difficult and understandable as well. So the only option for India was diplomacy, and it should have been allowed to work. But instead, the aggressive forward policy was misinterpreted by China, and now China concluded that Nehru had to be taught a lesson. India had to be taught a lesson. This is not my personal opinion. Many analysts and experts and historians, they are all of the view that one primary reason why China went to war in 1962 was to put India down, to teach India a lesson, put India in its place. Here I present an argument in a Harvard study. The Harvard University has conducted a thorough study of the failure of Nehru in handling China, and it presents 2 possible reasons as to what instigated China to go to war. One was definitely to retaliate against the instigations caused by the policies of Nehru. be it accepting Tibetan refugees, allowing a parallel Tibetan government to function from India, and mainly the forward policy, the aggressive forward deployment of Indian troops. So these collectively, right, have been held responsible for possible Chinese aggression. All right, of course, China wanted to secure its interests in Aksai Chin. It wanted to ensure that India doesn't pose a problem in the western sector. And another possible reason here could be a domestic reason. Because internally, according to researchers, China was indeed facing a challenge. Mao Zedong's popularity was taking a hit because his so-called Great Leap Forward, which was a socio-economic revolution that he had planned, was failing. Under the Great Leap Forward, the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong, they were looking to champion social reforms, cultural and economic reforms. Very revolutionary steps and changes were taken up to change the very nature of China's society and economy. But these reforms were failing. They were having adverse consequences internally on China. It was affecting the popularity of the Communist Party and Mao Zedong. So internally, there was a need for a political distraction. And what better than an external war with an enemy? So maybe either one of them or maybe both of them in combination could have pushed China to go to war against India. So China was the aggressor, no doubt. It was Chinese aggression against India. But there were opportunities for India to prevent this from happening. Through better diplomacy, through better strategic policy making, possibly India could have averted the final outcome. Right? So this is where Nehru is criticized by several experts from across the political spectrum. And it's alleged that Nehru committed several strategic and even tactical blunders even during the course of the war. So Nehru was largely misguided by his then defense minister, Mr. Menon, and several historians hold both of them accountable for the eventual loss that India suffered. So China opened multiple fronts against India from Ladakh to Sikkim to Arunachal Pradesh, and especially in the northeast sector, Chinese troops invaded into India. They came as close to Tezpur in Assam, and essentially they were just a short distance away from Siliguri and Calcutta. So this really sent shockwaves across the Indian establishment. It was a massive defeat for India, right? China would occupy Aksai Chin, and since then it has remained under Chinese illegal occupation. We claim Aksai Chin correctly, but it remains under the illegal occupation as China cemented its territorial gain. That was the primary reason as well as to why China went to war with India. To get hold of Aksai Chin, given its strategic significance, and to put Nehru down, to put India down. So this is where Nehru faces legitimate criticism regarding his failed policy in handling China. He failed to understand how diplomacy and force had to be leveraged. There has to be a fine balance between your projection of military power and your diplomacy. While you're building a friendly relationship, right? That's what we want. At the end of the day, we want friendly relations. It should be backed up with your military strength to deter the enemy and deter any hostile actions. But there was a complete mismatch in the diplomacy force equation that was employed by the Nehru administration. The lack of overall military preparedness is also attributed as a cause for the disastrous defeat that India suffered. It was a huge psychological blow for the Indian government, for the Indian armed forces as well, and for Indian people in general. It's from here that China became a massive threat for India, at least in the eyes of the Indian public. It led to a strategic nexus being formed between China and Pakistan. As they say, enemy is enemy, they are bound to become friends. Right? Even Kautilya Arthashastra, in the Arthashastra, Kautilya or Chanakya, he speaks about Ari becoming Mitra. Right? Enemy is enemy becoming a friend. And it's quite natural in geopolitics. So there was a clear nexus that developed, an alignment between China and Pakistan, the two hostile neighbors of India. And Pakistan even signed a boundary agreement in 1963, the Sino-Pakistan boundary agreement, through which it leased a part of POK to China. I'm talking about the Shaksgam Valley, which you can see in the map. The strategic Shaksgam Valley located over here, which should be a part of Jammu and Kashmir, right? It's under illegal occupation of Pakistan. This territory was ceded away to China and even today remains under Chinese control. The controversial CPEC project, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is opposed by India, right, passes through Shaksgam Valley and POK. That's the prime reason why we oppose China's Belt and Road Initiative today, right? So this was one immediate outcome. So in short, with regard to the boundary dispute, the way the boundary issue was handled, the way the relationship was developed with China, without doubt, there were mistakes committed by Nehru, and that is exactly what most experts agree upon. Now, coming to my last point, did Nehru really give away the UN permanent seat to China? Right? There is a lot of chatter on social media, on WhatsApp groups, on YouTube, on Twitter, right? Even so-called influencers, they keep propagating this theory that India had been offered a UN permanent seat and Nehru gifted this away to China. Even political opponents, right from the BJP to others, have raised this allegation against Nehru. Now, let's set this theory to rest once for all. There is very clear evidence available to show that such a seat was never offered to India in the first place. There was nothing that India could give away to China, to gift away to China. The incident that some of them refer to, right? I'll tell you what the incident was about. The US had sent out a feeler to India, just a message, not even an informal seat was offered. It was just a message, a message through the Indian ambassador, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, the sister of Nehru, who was the Indian ambassador to US at that point in Washington, right? Was reached out by the State Department, and the US State Department just conveyed this just to test India's reaction that US is willing to back India as a permanent member to UNSC instead of China. Because this offer, when it came in 1950, the offer came in 1950 from the US, there was still a question whether PRC should have the permanent seat or Republic of China in Taiwan should have the permanent seat. There was still a confusion about which is the legitimate Chinese government. Is it PRC in mainland China, ruled by the Communist Party, or the Kuomintang Party ruling Taiwan in, that is, Republic of China? So, when Republic of China was still holding on to the UN seat, right, this feeler from US was sent out across to India through Indian ambassador in the US, Vijayalakshmi Pandit. This was communicated to Nehru, and what Nehru said was, this was clearly a trap by the US, a bait. The US was focusing on its Cold War rivalries with the Soviet Union. Now, PRC, being a communist power, would obviously align with Soviet Union, right? The US needed a leverage to break the Soviet-China partnership, or at least reduce China's influence in Asia and create problems in Asia that could undermine the PRC. So one idea was to prop this suggestion that could India be a permanent member instead of China. Now, this was not a formal proposal at all, not even an informal proposal, because US alone cannot do that. If anyone knows the UN Charter, if anyone knows how a new permanent member can be added, it's only through approval of all P5 countries. All the permanent members have to approve this, right? UK, France, and Soviet Union should have backed this as well, not just the US. There should have been a formal offer given. This never happened. Even if, let's say, US had insisted on India being made a permanent member, I'll tell you why it wasn't in India's interest to accept this. Nehru correctly rejected the offer because this was clearly a US bait, a US trap. US, as always, right, was looking after its own interests. It was looking to drive a divide between India, China to weaken Chinese influence in Asia and further undermine Soviet influence. This could have complicated our relations with Soviet Union as well. And also, don't forget, let's say such an offer had come from UK, US and France, all the democratic countries of the permanent members, right, have still defeated this with its veto. Right, Soviet Union, which has the veto, would have defeated such a resolution. It would have never backed India's permanent membership at that point in the place of China. China, which was a communist ally, because India was non-aligned at that point. This was also an American strategy to pull India towards the Western bloc. India didn't want to get caught in this Cold War rivalry between the Western democracies and the communist powers. So correctly, this feeler that was sent by US was rejected by Nehru. So this was not a rejection of any UN SE seat. There was no such offer given to India. So using this, a conspiracy theory has been propagated for many years, mainly by a few political elements, right? That India had been given a UN SE seat and India rejected it and gifted it away to China. It was never offered to India in the first place, right? No other permanent member would have accepted that. Britain wouldn't have supported that. Soviet Union wouldn't have supported that. It was simply a feeler sent out to India to test whether can we use this opportunity. Let's say India publicly, India and US say that we are looking to put India as a permanent member, just to see whether that could divide relations between India and China and further destabilize the communist power bloc. Right? That would have been the American strategy, and correctly Nehru saw through this and rejected any such ideas. So there is no question of India rejecting the seat or giving it away to China. So please don't fall for the political propaganda here. But where it deserves, the criticism definitely is valid. As I told you, Nehru is not entirely accountable or not responsible for recognizing China. That was not even a mistake in the first place. It was the right thing to do. A realistic policy was to recognize China and build close relations with China. Coming to Tibet again, no such mistake can be attributed here. Recognizing Tibet was the eventual option. But one drawback here was possibly Nehru could have leveraged the recognition to get guarantees from China regarding India's security, regarding the borders, which wasn't done. But this is where Nehru failed. Nehru committed blunders. From his idealistic faith and trust in China to the mishandling of the border issue, the lack of strategic vision, the ill thought out forward policy, and the eventual strategic tactical blunders. This is where Nehru lost to China. Nehru faces a lot of criticism correctly and rightly is held accountable as well by many experts and historians. Coming to the last one, right? Nehru need not be criticized for this because there was no such permanent seat offered to India in reality. No formal proposal ever came up. Even if it came up, no one else would have supported this as well. There's no question of India gifting it away to China. Correctly, Nehru rejected the offer, any advances from the US, to ensure that India-China relations were not damaged by the American intervention. So on this note, I would like to bring the discussion to an end. Please take a look at a couple of practice questions. Which of the following statements are correct? McMahon Line was the boundary drawn between Tibet and British India. It was established through the Shimla Convention of 1914. Today it lies between Sikkim of India and Tibet of China. How many of the statements are correct? So please let me know the correct answer. I've already explained this point. So let me know the answer in the comments. Take up 2 mains questions as well for your answer writing practice. It's all related to what we have discussed today. You can write answers and post them in the comments so that you can help other aspirants and you can even review the answers of other aspirants. So on this note, I would like to bring my discussion to an end. I hope it's been a fruitful discussion. I hope you guys have liked it. Do let me know what you think in the comments. If you liked it, do press the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So tomorrow, join me again at 7 p.m. for another interesting topic where we will discuss some of the policy mistakes committed by Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi in Sri Lanka with regard to the ethnic conflict of Sri Lanka. We will explore the big question, did India sponsor LTTE in Sri Lanka? So I'll see you tomorrow. Till then, take care. Have a good night.